Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today the RTX 50 series rollout continues with the RTX 5060 Ti. To be specific, we're talking about the 5060 Ti 16GB as, yes, there is still an 8GB model in 2025. But to try and at least stay a bit more positive, we do have the good news that the 5060 Ti 16GB is at least starting at a lower price point than its predecessor, coming in at £399 here in the UK or $429 US. So with that in mind, exactly what can this GPU bring to the table? That's what we're going to find out in today's video. Getting right into it then, just yesterday Nvidia announced the new RTX 5060 series, comprising two 5060 Ti models, the 16 and 8GB card, alongside the base RTX 5060, which is coming later on in May. This video is all about the 5060 Ti 16GB though, and from the sounds of it, it really doesn't seem like there's going to be much, if any, focus on the 8GB card for launch, so all we're talking about today is the 16GB card. In terms of its specs, I'm not going to go through everything line by line, but it is using a new GB206 die, measuring in 181 square millimeters, and really it just offers less of everything compared to the 5070. Fewer cores, fewer ROPs, narrower bus width, you name it. The only irony being there is that the 16GB 5060 Ti obviously has more VRAM, but more on that later. It is also a lower power chip too, topping out at 180 watts. Now, there's no Founders Edition for the 5060 Ti or even the 5060, and I did all of my testing with two AIB cards. The bulk of my game testing was done with the Palit Infinity 3, which is an MSRP board, fairly basic, but it is running at reference clocks. Then I was also sent the Gigabyte Aorus Elite, which is a much more premium model, and we're going to take a look at that later on in the video when we come to things like thermals and noise levels. All testing was also done using our regular GPU test system, and this is powered by MSI. This is packing in AMD's Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, and that's paired with the MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard. We also have 64GB of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 6000 CL30 latency, and all testing was done on MSI's MPG 321 URX QD-OLED 4K monitor. The final thing to say though is that in this video we are focusing on the 1080p and the 1440p data. I did also test 4K, but I don't think it's hugely relevant to this GPU. But if you do want to see that and every single one of our charts, you can find that over in the written review on kitguru.net, and I'll leave a link to that down in the description and in the pinned comment. Kicking off with Alan Wake 2 then, at 1080p, the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB manages 61 FPS on average, and that makes it 6% slower than AMD's RX 7700 XT, but it is 17% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB it replaces. At 1440p, its average of 43 FPS is still playable enough, while it's now caught up to the 7700 XT and comes in 20% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB. Moving on to Black Myth Wukong, it is a stronger showing from the 5060 Ti 16GB model here, given its average of 45 FPS actually puts it ahead of the RX 7800 XT, and it's only a whisker behind the 7900 GRE. 1440p is not what I'd consider playable, however, given the 1% lows do drop below 30 FPS, and for reference, the 5060 Ti 16GB is 24% slower than the RTX 5070 here. It does have a more significant 28% lead over the 4060 Ti 16GB, which is one of the bigger improvements we'll see today, but you'd likely want to lower image quality or enable DLSS if playing at 1440p. As for Cyberpunk, we're looking at an average frame rate of just under 110 FPS, and that puts the 5060 Ti 16GB just 6% ahead of the RX 7700 XT, while it's 21% faster than its direct predecessor. Up at 1440p, it does extend its lead over the 4060 Ti 16GB to 34%, and we do know from prior 50 series reviews that the Red engine seems to scale particularly well with the Blackwell architecture. Versus the 7700 XT though, it's just 4% faster. Dragon Age the Veilguard is a new one to our test suite, and it does seem to favour Nvidia hardware, with the 5060 Ti 16GB actually matching the RX 7900 GRE, while it's 18% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. At 1440p, it still churns out 55 FPS on average, though here we're now looking at a deficit of 28% compared to the RTX 5070. As for Final Fantasy XVI, at 1080p we once again see performance that's essentially identical to the RX 7700 XT, while we're looking at a 12% uplift over the 4060 Ti 16GB. Stepping up to 1440p does drop the 1% lows below 30 FPS, as this is a very GPU heavy game, so again you'll likely want to enable DLSS for smoother frame rates. Ghost of Tsushima is next though, and this is a game where Nvidia GPUs seem to underperform quite significantly. At 1080p for instance, even the Intel Arc B580 is faster than the 5060 Ti 16GB, while it's also 16% slower than the 7700 XT. The same goes for 1440p as well. It is still very playable, hitting 52 FPS on average, but that only puts it on par with the 4-year-old RX 6700 XT. Moving on though, Horizon Forbidden West is a game that uses more than 8GB of VRAM even at 1080p when using the very high preset. Of course, that's no issue for the 5060 Ti 16GB model, but even then, performance gains over the 4060 Ti 16GB are basically non-existent. I do wonder if there's another limitation at play, perhaps memory bandwidth or even the PCIe lane allocation, as this is another Gen 5 by 8 GPU. It's hard to say, but just a 3% gain over its direct predecessor at 1080p is very disappointing. At 1440p that does stretch to 7%, but even that is hardly cause for celebration. We can also see performance that's level with the RX 7700 XT. Moving on to another new game in our suite though, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 shows much more of a generational improvement for the 5060 Ti 16GB, given it's 21% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB at 1080p, averaging 89 FPS. At 1440p, that lead even stretches to 24%, while performance is only just behind the 7900 GRE. The 5060 Ti 16GB also does well in A Plague Tale Requiem, hitting 79 FPS at 1080p, and that puts it right on par with the 7800 XT. At 1440p, things are still very close overall up against the 7800 XT, though it does now come in 26% slower than the RTX 5070. Ratchet and Clank though is another title where the 5060 Ti 16GB and the 7800 XT go head to head. The average frame rates are very similar, but AMD does have a slight advantage for the 1% lows at 1080p. The same also goes at 1440p, and here we can see a 12% uplift for the 5060 Ti 16GB over its direct predecessor. Moving on though to Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, at 1080p the 5060 Ti 16GB manages 58 FPS on average, putting it level with the 7700 XT, while it's 17% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. 1440p is a tough ask at these settings though without any upscaling enabled, given the 5060 Ti 16GB only manages 40 FPS, making it 22% slower than the 5070. Lastly then, we come to Starfield with the 5060 Ti 16GB sitting alongside the 7700 XT on 55 FPS average, making it 16% slower than the RX 7800 XT. At 1440p though, we do still see 45 FPS on average, and this makes it 15% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. Over the 12 games tested then, the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB sits neatly between the RX 7700 XT and 7800 XT at 1080p, given it's 7% faster than the former, but 8% slower than the latter. We're also looking at 15% gains over the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, which isn't amazing, but also isn't bad in the context of the 50 series. Gains over the RTX 3060 Ti, however, average out at just 31%, and that really doesn't sound like much progress given that GPU launched all the way back at the end of 2020. Now, the 5060 Ti 16GB is also a decent 1440p option, though it does fall away at this resolution in comparison to other GPUs due to the relatively narrow 128-bit memory interface. Here it's just 5% faster than the 7700 XT and 10% slower than the 7800 XT on average, though it does now offer 19% better performance than its direct predecessor. Versus the 3060 Ti, we're looking at just a 33% gain. Interestingly though, cost per frame scales very similarly to the RTX 5070, given the 5060 Ti 16GB works out 26% slower, but also 26% cheaper in terms of the UK launch MSRPs. Now, you would hope that the cheaper model would be better value, so I do wonder if Nvidia is trying to push consumers towards the more expensive 70 class card. Both of AMD's RDNA 4 GPUs also offer superior value for rasterization. Again, this is when looking at MSRP. The situation is slightly different though when looking at current street pricing, with a lot of previous gen cards no longer available or at inflated prices due to supply. The 5060 Ti 16GB is still towards the top of the chart, though top spot is taken by the Arc B580, which can currently be found for just 250 quid. Overall value though is similar to the RX 7700 XT, which can be had for £380, though stock does appear to be drying up. Moving on to ray tracing performance though, here we're focusing on 1080p, and even with quality upscaling used, the path trace lighting in Alan Wake 2 reduces frame rates to just 40 FPS for the 5060 Ti 16GB. It is still miles ahead of the competition though, about on par with AMD's RX 9070, despite that GPU costing significantly more. Black Myth Wukong is similarly punishing as it also uses path tracing. This time the 5060 Ti 16GB is faster than even AMD's RX 9070 XT. It's also 22% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB. Cyberpunk though is much more manageable at 1080p, where we use the Ultra preset with no upscaling. This saw the 5060 Ti 16GB sit between the 7900 GRE and the 7900 XT, averaging 52 FPS. Indiana Jones though is the last of the new additions to our test suite, and two trends are noticeable. The first is that anything with just 8GB of VRAM absolutely crumbles even at 1080p, and the second is that despite having ray tracing as a foundational part of the game's engine, AMD GPUs still scale very well here, with the 5060 Ti 16GB coming in 5% behind the 7800 XT. Either way, 94 FPS is a great result. Ratchet and Clank though does scale much better on nvidia hardware with ray tracing enabled, as evidenced by the 5060 Ti 16GB coming within touching distance of the RX 9070, hitting 62 FPS on average. Returnal does fare much better for AMD GPUs, but it is still nvidia with the upper hand, given the 5060 Ti 16GB is almost matching the 7900 GRE, while it's a 19% gain over the 4060 Ti 16GB. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, and in this oldie but a goodie, the 5060 Ti 16GB makes light work of the ray trace shadows, hitting 116 FPS, and that puts it on par with the 7900 GRE. Lastly then, we come to Star Wars Outlaws, where the 5060 Ti 16GB delivers 49 FPS, putting it on par with the RX 7800 XT and marking an 11% improvement over its predecessor. All in all, the 5060 Ti 16GB is a decent GPU for ray tracing, at least at 1080p when using demanding settings. Its overall performance is pretty similar to AMD's RX 7900 XT, and that's a GPU that was selling for over £700 plus over its lifetime, while it also comes in 15% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB. Gains over the 3060 Ti are also much bigger than what we saw for rasterization, this time hitting 64% on average, and a lot of that is down to the memory capacity. Of course, there is also more to the story when we come on to DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation, and here I do want to point out what I feel is some pretty misleading marketing from nvidia. The announcement presentation for the 5060 Ti 16GB, for instance, showed frame rates and latency for the GPU running Cyberpunk at 1440p DLSS quality mode, but with path tracing enabled. Using MFG4X, nvidia claimed 108 FPS and 81 milliseconds of latency, and actually, my own numbers aren't really too far from those figures. However, when those numbers are taken in isolation, they really lack context, and I do not think playing path trace games at 1440p with MFG4X is a good idea on this GPU. For one, latency is silly high considering the starting base frame rate is so low. Given we averaged 102 FPS using MFG4X, simple maths tells us that only 26 of those frames were traditionally rendered, so that is a very low frame rate to start from, and we actually saw latency come in 40% higher compared to no frame generation when using MFG4X. On top of that, the numbers alone only tell half the story, as MFG is very much a visual technology, with only 26 quote-unquote real frames for every 3 AI-generated frames. Visual errors like ghosting and image garbling become very obvious, as you can see in these examples. Now, 1080p I think is a much more realistic use case for MFG, as the base frame rate will be that much higher. Here we topped out at just 53 milliseconds of latency, with 42 quote-unquote real frames being rendered using MFG4X, and that is a lot more playable. The same also goes for Alan Wake 2. 1440p with path tracing is just way too much for this caliber of GPU, even using DLSS super resolution quality, so when you add MFG on top, the latency actually increases to over 120 milliseconds. At 1080p though, things are more manageable. Now, the base frame rate is still fairly low at 40 FPS, so you may even want to consider DLSS balanced or even performance, but it is definitely a better experience than 1440p. Of course, some games are that much easier to run, such as Hogwarts Legacy, where even with everything maxed out at 1440p, including ultra ray tracing, you will get a good experience on the 5060 Ti 16GB. To prove that, here we have a starting frame rate of 102 FPS before enabling MFG, so latency never really becomes a problem. That is definitely something to keep in mind with MFG. It is a technology I quite like and use often for my personal gaming sessions, but you do have to be realistic with the starting frame rate, otherwise latency becomes a real issue, as can the visual quality.
With 20 years of PC manufacturing experience, CyberPower PC are the best in the business. With the largest range of parts available in the UK, our team of experienced builders will expertly build and test each system to be delivered to you the very next day. Check out cyberpowersystem.co.uk.
Let's move on though and take a quick look at the two partner cards I was sent for this review. The first is the Palit Infinity 3, and technically I do actually have the OC model, but all testing was done at reference specifications. Now this is an MSRP card and it is a no frills design. There's no dual BIOS, no RGB, it's made entirely from black plastic, even down to the backplate. It is still a triple fan setup though, and it's only 2 slots thick. Safe to say it won't be winning any beauty awards, but we'll find out about the cooling performance in just a minute. As for our second model, this is the Aorus Elite from Gigabyte, a much more premium offering, given it does have a dual BIOS switch, there's RGB lighting on the back, sides and around the fan blades, plus the backplate is metal with an absolutely ginormous flow-through area. Now, it is still only a dual slot thickness, but at 328mm long and 128mm tall, it is certainly a fair bit bigger than the Palit card, but it is definitely better looking in my opinion. Both cards only use a single 8-pin power connector too, so there's no 12V high power here, though I hear some cards may have that and some may not, but for me, considering the power demands, a single 8-pin is the obvious choice. When testing both ARB cards then, we can clearly see a huge clock speed advantage for the Aorus Elite, given it ran at just under 2900MHz, whereas the Palit Infinity 3 couldn't even hit 2800MHz. Both GPU's frequency plots are almost completely flat too, and that usually indicates that they are not power limited, perhaps they're voltage limited instead. For confirmation then, averaged over the 30-minute stress test, the Aorus Elite hit 2895MHz compared to 2752MHz for the reference clocked Infinity 3. It certainly sounds a lot on paper, but remember that sort of difference usually only equates to a handful of FPS in the real world. As for temperatures though, both cards did very well here, though the Aorus Elite of course ran the coolest, hitting 54.6 degrees and 58 degrees on the GPU and VRAM respectively when using the performance BIOS. The Palit is still very good, this time with the VRAM topping out at 70 degrees and the GPU stayed below 65 degrees at all times. As for noise levels, here we've compared these two 5060 Ti 16GB cards against other 50 series models we have tested, and they do compare favourably. The Aorus Elite was absolutely dead quiet, dropping fan speed to just 1000 RPM in its silent mode, and even the performance mode hit just 1220 RPM, making it effectively inaudible. Now, the Palit Infinity 3 was a bit louder at 36 decibels, given the fan spun up to 1540 RPM, but it is still easy on the ears and it's much quieter than something like the 5070 Founders Edition. As we'd expect then, when noise normalised, the Aorus Elite does deliver superior results, bettering the Infinity 3 by 10 to 12 degrees depending on whether you're looking at the GPU or the VRAM. Now, it's fair to say we would expect this given it's the bigger and heavier card, but it's still not like the Palit's results are bad. Moving on to power draw, however, just a quick reminder that here we do use NVIDIA's PCAT tool, and this allows us to measure power draw of the graphics card only, both from the 8-pin connector and also from the PCIe slot. We do this on a per game per resolution basis, so we can see exactly how much power every single GPU tester draws in every single game at every single resolution. Of course, that is a lot of data to go through, so we're not going to go over absolutely everything in this video, but if you do want to see all of that charts and all of those data, head over to the written review on kitguru.net. Here we're focusing on the average then, and overall, despite the 5060 Ti 16GB having a rated TGB of 180 watts, in practice we saw power draw averaging just under 150 watts at 1080p. The closest we came to the 180 watt figure was 174 watts in a Plague Tale Requiem, but overall power demands are very reasonable and easily dealt with by a single 8-pin connector. Up at 1440p, power draw does increase slightly, now averaging 158 watts, but that's still just a 5 watt increase over the 4060 Ti 16GB, and that indicates a clear efficiency gain. Speaking of efficiency though, the frugal power demands of the 5060 Ti 16GB coupled with its overall performance make it a very efficient GPU for 1080p gaming. Now, I haven't included the RTX 5080 in this chart as it's really a different class of card, but that GPU is still the most efficient 50 series part yet, but the 5060 Ti 16GB does very well, tying the 5070 at the top. At 1440p, the RX 9070 does come on a bit stronger and actually claims top spot there, but the 5060 Ti 16GB is only just behind in terms of performance per watt. It also delivers a 14% efficiency gain compared to the 4060 Ti 16GB. So that really brings us to the end of my review of the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, and I personally think the term mixed bag really sums up this GPU. Starting with the negative points, just a 31% gain over the RTX 3060 Ti for rasterization really seems like a quite underwhelming result considering that GPU launched at the end of 2020, and I think we'd all hope for further progress in 5 years. In the context of today's market though, it is still delivering circa 15% gains over its predecessor, the 4060 Ti 16GB, and that actually sounds not too bad compared to some other Blackwell GPUs when you remember the fact that the 5070 was just 1 to 5% ahead of the 4070 Super. Now, as much as we may want larger and more significant generational gains, I mean, who doesn't? That's just not the reality for the 50 series, considering it is still fabbed on TSMC's 4N node, so I do think we need to be a bit more realistic with our expectations. We do also see the 5060 Ti 16GB pull way ahead of the RTX 3060 Ti when it comes to ray tracing as well, thanks in part to the doubled VRAM buffer. 8GB cards these days just cannot deliver certain experiences when ray tracing enabled, resulting in the 5060 Ti 16GB being multiple times faster in titles we looked at, including Indiana Jones and The Great Circle. There's also some good news in terms of pricing, with the £399 or $429 MSRP for the 16GB model being a decent chunk better than the 4060 Ti's launch price. There is, of course, a lot of things going on in the world right now which causes PC hardware prices to be fairly fluid, shall we say, but I do at least have some confidence in the fact that the 5060 Ti 16GB might actually be available at MSRP, considering that the 5070 has been readily in stock at MSRP over the last few weeks. Heck, we've even seen it under MSRP over the last week, as we reported on, I think it was last Friday, so I'm really optimistic that things will hopefully stay the same for the 5060 Ti 16GB, and that cards at the £399 MSRP will be a reality. What really strikes me about this GPU, however, and kind of what leads me on to my conclusion, is the fact that it really does seem to lack a clear competitor. Yes, AMD's RX 7700 XT and 7800 XT are competitive when it comes to just rasterization performance, but they have several other pretty significant downsides. The first is that availability really is starting to dry up, and it is becoming a lot harder to find those cards now. The second is that ray tracing performance is absolutely miles behind the 5060 Ti 16GB, and those RDNA 3 GPUs have no promises of support for FSR4, resulting in DLSS 4 and particularly the transformer model, resulting in hugely better image quality if you do play at, say, 1440p using the quality upscaling. To me then, all of those factors are significant enough that I just wouldn't recommend an RDNA 3 GPU over the 5060 Ti 16GB. The rumoured 9060 XT is expected to go head to head with NVIDIA in this market segment, but that is just that, still a rumour. We've not heard anything concrete, so we'll have to wait and see what develops. I actually think that you could make the case that the RTX 5070 is really the biggest threat to the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. After all, it's readily in stock at MSRP, it offers performance that's some 35 to 40% better depending on the game, and it's not too much more expensive, starting at £529. That being said though, I do think the 5070 is priced high enough to still be out of reach for many, in which case I do think the 5060 Ti 16GB becomes pretty much the obvious and I guess the default choice around the £400 mark. Just please don't buy the 8GB model. Anyway guys, that is where I'm going to leave this video. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. You can also subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can find an invite link to our Discord server down in the description, and while there you'll also find a link to our merch store where you can pick up a cool t-shirt like one of the ones on screen. Finally, if you're feeling particularly generous, you can even consider backing us on Patreon. But that's it for me guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.